feathers off my head and feel a bit more lightheaded as I address the questions of democracy and human rights, challenges and opportunities. As the moderator said, I mean, the two are integral to each other, they're pivotal to each other, and I don't think you can really talk about democracy without human rights and vice versa. However, I think there are certain dimensions to this topic that need emphasizing in a sense. We are talking about both political and civil rights as well as economic and social rights. This is an old story in terms of you have challenges in terms of both of these things. And also, we are talking about formal functioning democracy, where we have processes like elections, but we're also talking about substantive elements of democracy, whereby the processes do not in any way obscure the actual spirit of democracy, the ethos of democracy in public life. And I think in South Asia, and not necessarily South Asia alone, today the world is facing something of a backlash against globalization. And as a consequence of that, minorities are being singled out everywhere in the world, particularly in South Asia, as being scapegoats of some kind or another. The majority communities in our society are obviously insecure because of an external threat. In Sri Lanka, we talk about a majority community with a minority complex, and that insecurity therefore leaves them with the default position of blaming the minorities for everything, particularly with regard to the access to resources and the reproduction of those resources. In Sri Lanka, for example, the minority communities are the most hooked in to the international network of globalization. Language, which has been used quite often as a key marker of authoritarianism and majoritarianism, as far as our societies are concerned, the minority communities are probably the most multilinguistic. Certainly within Sri Lanka, the Muslim community is the truly trilingual community in the country. And so there is a backlash against it in terms of the argument that they are the ones who are having greater access to resources, and because of their cultural practices, etc., this notion of this one great state where the majority community has found its home and where there is no external influences, or if there are external segments of the population, they are there because the majority community is willing to tolerate them, and therefore, as the president of my country once said, we have the spoon and we have the pot of rice, and we will dole it out or serve it as we see fit. So the identification of minorities as being problematic, as being threats, dangers, has therefore a knock-on impact on the survival of democracy. I think most of our societies, either formally or informally, have been organized around the principle of unity in diversity. Because at the end of the day, we are societies that are made up of various peoples, all of whom who have contributed towards the commonwealth and the collective good. But now I think what is happening is that the majoritarianism is trying to come up with one country, one law type of argument, which obliterates this notion of unity in diversity. And one country, one law, whilst it might appeal to some people as being a sort of notion of common civil code and all of that, is a way in which the majoritarianism asserts itself. Secondly, I want to suggest to you that as far as human rights and democracy are concerned, we have a challenge, and that is to incorporate corruption as a human right into the general discourse of human rights. Again, corruption is a cancer. It is impunity that goes with it. It is an absolute cancer that corrodes the entire body politic and the economy as well. And we have to treat it as being a squandering, a pilfering, a looting of what belongs to all of us. And therefore, that it is our human right to know what has happened to our money, how it has been spent, that there is accountability that goes with it. We recently had a session at the Human Rights Council in Geneva where they passed a resolution on Sri Lanka and introduced this notion of economic crimes, whereby the question of accountability in terms of the corruption, the whole-scale looting of the public finances has been now put on the agenda, and we need to develop it. We need to develop it further. We have to make sure that the offshore tax havens and all of that are brought into this ambit so that corruption is not going to be a scourge of democracy in our countries. The third area I think we need to look at and incorporate much more fully into our discourse of human rights and democracy is the environment. That is something that belongs to all of us, or it is everyone's concern. That is something as well which forces, if nothing else, an interdependence amongst states to come together to deal with. It is not something that can be divided up into, this is my sovereign territory and therefore I can do whatever I wish. It is everywhere, all over. And we need to incorporate it into our discourse on human rights as very, very fundamental, and into our discourse on democracy as well, because it's not just a question of what the majority wants, but it is also a question of how we treat our minorities and all other interests. The fourth area that I want to talk to you about, and I am going to be more specific, is all of this conversation about the center of the world shifting from Europe and North America to the East. And therefore, the conflict or the competition between China and India is going to be the key axis of competition and possibly conflict into the future. Now, India has been a long-standing democracy in South Asia and indeed in the world. China, of course, is a totalitarian or authoritarian state which has just made its president, given its president another term in office. What is the future going to be in terms of the competition or indeed the conflict? And I don't necessarily think that there is going to be conflict as such, but the competition between these two. Is India going to be the exemplar of democracy, liberalism, tolerance? Is China going to be at the other end of the pole in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of squashing of dissent and all of that? Or is it the case that they are going to become more like each other? And when I say more like each other, it means that India is going to become more authoritarian. As to whether China is going to become more democratic, I think the jury is out on that. But I think as we go on, as we go into the future, that system is also going to have to cave in to the stresses and strains that it faces. So at a collective level, into the future, I think in South Asia we all have a responsibility, those of us who believe in democracy and human rights, to ensure that that is maintained within our societies to begin with. That is not going to be, you mind your own business, we are a sovereign state and we will do whatever we damn well want. As I said at the opening plenary session, we need societies where institutions do not humiliate citizens. That is the structural, the procedural, the institutional dimensions of democracy and human rights. And, as I said, most importantly, you need a political culture that animates those structures and makes sure that they function in the way that they are supposed to. Therefore, citizens must not humiliate each other. So if we can commit ourselves to that, we are talking about constitutional changes, we are talking about a variety of changes within our societies to keep up with the world as technology proceeds apace, but we must not lose sight of those first principles. Thank you.